Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the panel discussion at the 6th Annual Robert Macmillan Graduate Research and Education Symposium. In order that we can share these proceedings more widely, you'll notice that our evening event is being recorded. My name is Wendy Crocker, and I'm a proud graduate of the program here at the Faculty of Education. 3 times, in fact. No, I'm not on an IEP. 1983 would have been Bachelor of Education. 1993 would have been Masters of Education. 2013 would have been the PhD, which might lead you to think that I am the one that's solely responsible for all of this plethora of new programs because I was running out of things to graduate with from the faculty. But all kidding aside, I feel that I am very honored and privileged to be here with these panelists this evening, and I am going to act as the moderator for the discussion. While it would appear as if things are a little bit formal, they're really not. What we're going to do is explore the topic of education for all. And in conjunction with these 3 distinguished educators and researchers, you'll notice their biographies beginning on page 7. And we're going to introduce them in just a minute. But first of all, to offer some context for the discussion, I suggest that the title of Education for All could be viewed as quite a motherhood statement. After all, who involved in education would oppose or counter a notion that education is a foundational principle and should not be adopted worldwide? However, the EFA movement is much larger than just the beliefs and opinions of practitioners and researchers in education. UNESCO, the United Nations Educational, Scientific, Cultural Organization, met in Dakar in the year 2000 in a World Education Forum, at which the delegates of 164 governments pledged to achieve education for all under 6 identified goals by the year 2015. These goals include expanding and improving comprehensive early childhood care and education, especially for the most vulnerable and disadvantaged children. Ensuring that by 2015, all children, particularly girls, in difficult circumstances and those belonging to ethnic minorities have access to and complete free and compulsory primary education of good quality. Goal number 3, ensuring that the learning needs of all young people and adults are met through equitable access to appropriate learning and life skills programs. Goal number 4, achieving a 50% improvement in levels of adult literacy by 2015, especially for women, and equitable access to basic and continuing education for all adults. Goal number 5, eliminating gender disparities in primary and secondary education by 2005 and achieving gender equality in education by 2015 with a focus on ensuring girls' full and equal access to and achievement in basic education of good quality. Finally, goal number 6, improving all aspects of the quality of education and ensuring excellence of all so that recognized and measurable learning outcomes are achieved by all, especially in literacy, numeracy, and essential life skills. Tonight's discussion will attempt to explore this idea of education for all and how it's been taken up not only globally, but personally and professionally by each of our panelists. There are several questions that will be asked of each of our delegates, but there will also be an opportunity to open it up to you for probes, comments, or discussions. As I said, our proceedings are being recorded, so if you have a comment that you would like to make, I would invite you to raise your hand. It's now time to share the floor and the microphone with each of our guests, beginning on my right with Katina Pollak, and I would ask each of you in turn to introduce yourself briefly and offer your perspective on what does education for all mean to you.
Thank you everyone for inviting me. I sat in on the opening remarks from the Dean and from the organizing committee, and I just want to say that I think this is a really great opportunity for everyone to share. All of you in the organizing committee and attending in any way, shape, or form should be very proud of this evening. Catherine, also in memory of Bob, this is a great venue and event, and I think it will only grow as the years continue. I'm Katina Pollak, Associate Professor in the Faculty of Education here. My area of research tends to focus on leadership, teacher leadership, principal leadership, predominantly school leadership in the public education system. So I was asked to sit on this panel, and I was given homework to do. So we just don't show up. We all have, and we were told to do this homework. We actually got follow-up emails. So I just want you all to know that. I will try my best. You can grade me after and let me know how things go. So in thinking about education for all and what it means to me, I really had to sit back and ask myself. There are a number of things in that whole phrase, education for all. So the first thing for me was, what do we mean by education? There's schooling, and there's formal schooling, and then there's education. And if we think about it, we've all probably experienced a little bit of both. We're here in a higher education system. Some of us have been more successful than others in the formal schooling that exists, but we've all had some kind of education in our lives. So my thoughts around that were, what education and for whom? I teach in the educational Ed.D. program, the educational doctorate, and the course I'm currently teaching right now is all about the aims of education. And I teach with my colleague, Brenton Faubert, here in the audience, and we have some very interesting conversations about the purposes of education and the aims of education. And while I would agree with Wendy, nobody would ever disagree that we should not have an education for all, but my concern is more about what kind of education that is and what it looks like in moving forward. And what do we mean for all? For all and for whom? In many jurisdictions, there is education for all, but what that all looks like and how it unfolds for everybody is somewhat different depending on who you are. That would be what I would call something that I'm very keenly aware of and sometimes concerned about. So how I see the world through a lens of power, and usually around access. So who gets access to what? So while we might have children who physically attend classes and attend school, that doesn't mean they're actually getting schooled. They might be getting an education around different kinds of things that we may not necessarily want them to experience. But I also my research has focused in the last 7 years around access, and that access can be around learning broadly, not necessarily in public schooling, but also access to higher education and access to the workforce. And that entails more than just what we would call curriculum found in jurisdictional policies. There's hidden curriculum. There's also learning around what I would call all of the capitals. So it's cultural capital, the political capital, all sorts of things. Having political acumen, all of those kinds of things that we don't always necessarily talk about nor teach in a formalized public education system or in higher education. And I think, how do I see this and where do I see it going? I think that I want to be hopeful, but I'm a little hesitant about necessarily being hopeful because I think education for all includes more than just educators in a formalized education system and setting. Education for all means that we need to think broadly about how we educate children and adults, and that includes things around housing, around inclusive education, and not just inclusive education in narrower terms or in formal schooling or public schooling, but also in higher education. So I don't know if you want me to continue there. I think I'll leave it open because I think my colleagues here on the panel would like to jump in on some things that I have said, and I will obviously respond.
So I'll hand it over to you. Bill was taking notes, so I think he's ready to go.
Yeah. I was feeling the tension there, so we'll just let
that's me.
jump
I'm
right
always
in.
tense.
Yeah,
All right.
yeah.
Hello, everyone. So my name is Bill Tucker, and I have a privilege of working at the faculty and being here for about 1.5 years now. 35 years in the public education system. Almost 6 years as Director of Education for Thames Valley District School Board. I've been Superintendent of Special Education. I've been Superintendent of Human Resources. I've been Superintendent of Operations Services. I've been a Principal, Vice Principal, my favorite job, classroom teacher. So I agree with everything Katina said. Candace, you're next. So I'm just going to offer a few comments because I'm really looking forward to questions from the floor. Whenever I hear education for all students can learn, I have trouble with that phrase. I'd rather hear education for each. Think about that. Education for each. In other words, I think that bumps up the responsibility of the educator. Because education for all, or all students can learn, or all educators can build capacity, that's too watered down for me. That means everyone has access, but education for each implies, from my way of thinking, a responsibility to provide the student, provide the staff member, provide the adult with what they need to succeed. So that's always been my way of thinking, and I just remember that feeling of helplessness as a classroom teacher when I couldn't successfully program for a student. Either there was a mental health issue, or there were some challenges the family was going through, and it's just as an educator, and regardless if you're standing in front of standing in front of the classroom or working away, or you're in an administrative role, being provided the tools that in turn allow you to provide the programming, the supports necessary for a child or family to succeed. That's what's critically important. And knowing that you don't have all the answers, but it's who you can work with to get those answers that are required. And I'm going to look at Wendy because you know me, when I get in my soapbox, it's tough to kick me off.
Don't worry.
Yeah, I know you'll get it, yeah. So, this is such an important topic because in terms of education for all, the role of the educator and building capacity, there's a question there about sustainability. Well, sustainability to me is a two-way street. Sustainability, once you get to a certain level, sustain that level in terms of programming and ability? No. You need to keep working at it. You need to rise above that level where you've become... Sustainability to me means stillness. But sustain your internal drive to improve, leading to education for each, leading to your own capacity that continuously strives for improvement. And that's why I love this faculty of education. That's why I enjoy working in graduate studies, because you have an opportunity to provide that mechanism. The link between research and practice is so vital for this very concept. If we don't have that bridge, if we don't have that ability to link best practices that are evident through research and utilize that as a staff, utilize that in the classroom, utilize that as a community, because I believe fundamentally community is responsible for education. If we don't have that, then what are we here for? And to me, when we say teaching practice, it is a practice. It takes 10,000 hours for a professional athlete to perfect a certain move. 10,000 hours of the free throw. Well, 10,000 hours of teacher practice, and then another 10,000 hours. Utilizing the research that's out there. The day an educator closes his or her door is the day they start dying a slow professional death. And so education for each, for me, implies a responsibility for the educator, for the administrator, and for the community to seek continuously best practices and then go back through the research loop and see if it's actually working. And I'm going to stop there because I got lots more to say, and I'll just bide my time.
Now I know why they invited me to moderate this panel. It's my background in equestrian studies. It has nothing to do with education, so that I can put the spurs on and pull back on the reins. And I know who might need which. Now, to your right, we're pleased to welcome Candace. Candace, would you like to introduce yourself and respond to what you believe education for all means?
Hani, Bojo, Sagoli, Kiakulamalsi, Wache, Tanse, Kwekwe, Bonjour, and hello. My name is Candace Burnett, and I just said hello to you in many different Indigenous languages. In English, my name is Candace, but my spirit name is Wabin Jesus, and I think it's really important for me to begin with that because that's very important in the perspective that I'm going to be coming from, which is an Indigenous perspective. I have not as much experience as my fellow panelists, for sure, but my work centers in Aboriginal communities. I've worked at the K-12 level, and I'm working more currently in post-secondary education, and so that's the frame of reference that I come from. And so when I started thinking about answering this question, I thought of a scholar named Margaret Kovach, and she says, we know what we know from where we stand. So I want to share with you a little bit about me, and that'll give you a sense of, I guess, how I approach things, because for me, I think my perspective is best told through a story. And Thomas King, who is a Cherokee writer and author, who is quite celebrated, he talks about the truth about stories is that's all that we are. So for as long as I can remember, and forgive me, I'm going to read a little bit. I won't read for the whole panel, but I do want to read for this because I want to capture the essence of my story. So for as long as I can remember, I've envisioned my life's work centering on social justice issues and working with Aboriginal people. I really learned this, I guess, as a young girl, watching my mother work in the justice system as a court worker. She worked in the overcrowded justice system or justice courtrooms in Northern Ontario, advocating for Aboriginal people's voices in a foreign system that they didn't have a voice, and so she would speak for them when they didn't have a voice within that system. And I guess she left an impression on me. And it wasn't until I was in undergraduate school, when I took Aboriginal studies at the University of Toronto, that I discovered my calling in education. It was actually in post-secondary that I first became engaged in school. Up until that point, I really, and I'll talk a little bit about my experience in school, but I wasn't engaged. But for the first time, something was lit. I guess my learning spirit was ignited in university. I started learning for the first time about residential schools in Canada and the impacts on Aboriginal people and community. And then I started looking at myself and looking at how that history affected me personally. You see, my Nokam, which is grandmother for Cree, in our culture, she's considered to be the first teacher. My grandmother is a residential school survivor. She was apprehended and forced to attend an Anglican-operated and federally legislated boarding school from the age of 7 to 16. She did not go home after the end of the day. She literally lived there year-round. And during these very early developmental years, my grandmother, Nokam, she was isolated from her family. She was taken away from the land and her community, and she was socially conditioned through hidden curriculum to assimilate into the dominant Euro-Western culture. My grandmother actually was born on the trap line. Her first language was Cree, and my great-grandparents hunted and fished to survive. So she was taken from that. And instead of growing up like that, she was forced to speak English, and she was beaten if she spoke Cree, and she was forced to adopt Christian values. As a result of this traumatic experience, the system, the education system, our Canadian system, actually shaped my grandmother's low self-esteem, limited her potential, and it fractured the trust that our family for generations has in schooling systems. So in many ways, after that, a lot of our family had a deeply ingrained fear. Whether we were conscious of it or not, there was a deeply ingrained fear that educational authorities would take away our children and strip away our culture. My mother and her 16, and yes, my grandmother had 17 kids, attended underfunded and impoverished schools in Northern Ontario where they were not encouraged to go past grade school. My mother left school in grade 10 when she got pregnant with me, and as a single parent, she raised me and my sister the best that she could. We lived on social assistance. My mother admittedly carried much shame for not having an education, and associated with the stigma of social assistance, she avoided going to my parent-teacher meetings. She felt inferior. There was a disconnect. For me, I felt it. I struggled in school myself. I had a very high rate of absenteeism. Very high. 1 year I actually missed over 100 days of school. I hated school. I hated it. I actually literally hid in my closet to avoid going to school. I would pretend that I was going to school and I would go and hide in my closet because I didn't like it so much. A lot of times I just felt like I faded into the background and no one really noticed whether I was there or not. I'm the first generation in my family to go on to university. I entered through the back door. And it was an access program offered because I didn't have the prerequisites to get into the front door. I took a Canadian history course. The professor started with contact, and then he just glimpsed over he glimpsed over the chapter on Aboriginal people. It was the reason why I took the course, and he just glimpsed over it. But more than this, at that time, what I remember most about that experience is I sat at the back of the class, and I was, I guess, kind of disengaged, but kind of engaged. And I was among a row of mature students, and there was two younger men, and they were kind of joking around, sitting at the back of the class, and we were talking about treaties. And the two young men were having a conversation, and I could hear them. I was sitting there, but I wasn't part of the conversation. And they said, quote unquote, "If you give an Indian a bottle of beer, they'll give you anything." My heart sunk into my feet. Viscerally, I felt like I was physically being shaken. They didn't physically shake me, but I felt physically shaken. This experience has left a lasting imprint on me. I think it was a defining moment, not in that they defined me, but I realized in that moment that the education system was broken, that there's something needed to change. My transition years through university were trying times. It took me 9 years to complete undergraduate degree, and I carried the stigma. It was invisible, but it was the stigma with knowing I got admitted through the back door. I also felt a cultural dislocation. I didn't see a lot of people like me. I wasn't reflected in what I was learning until I came into Aboriginal studies. Eventually, though, I found my way to Aboriginal Student Services on campus, and this completely shifted everything for me. It was my home away from home. It was a source of connection and community and belonging. And it helped me turn a difficult situation into a victorious one. I wouldn't have imagined then that 15 years later I'd be, running one of those units at another institution. It was beyond my comprehension at the time. I guess what I want to leave you with is that colonial histories have shaped the relationships between Aboriginal people like myself and educational institutions like public systems, like higher education, like universities and colleges. And these relationships are wrought with tensions and distrust. Schools were the primary tool used to try and assimilate and suppress, kill the Indian in the child. This is what we carry with us when we enter the systems. One person that comes to mind as a warrior for what everything the Education for All stands for is a young woman by the name of Shannon Costigan. How many of you have heard of Shannon? A couple of you. Shannon is Cree, and you might think that I'm being a bit biased here because I come from a Cree community. But for me, she is the ultimate defender of human rights. Shannon was from Attawapiskat, which is a community north of my community. I'm from Fort Albany. She's from Attawapiskat. She was 13 years old when she traveled from her home community in west coast of James Bay to Ottawa to stand up to the federal government after they decided that they were going to refuse to build a school. Shannon, her whole school, from all of her grade school years, she attended school in a portable. Their school was actually closed down because there was contamination after an oil spill that affected and contaminated the brownfield. So these young children, these young Indigenous children, would go to school in portables. And after class, and while they changed classrooms, they would go out into the bitter cold. If you've ever been in northern Saskatchewan or northern Attawabascat, you know what I'm talking about. I actually visited that school when I was a recruitment officer. The students actually wear their winter coats. They were wearing their winter coats because it was so cold. And there were boarded up windows that had been broken, but they couldn't actually fix them because the federal government didn't provide funding for them to be fixed. So the children would just wear winter coats. She didn't think this was right anyways, and she, through her voice and the work that she did in Ottawa, she helped unearth one of the largest human rights campaigns in Canada. It was called Education is a Human Rights Campaign, and over 100 schools participated and held public actions to try and raise awareness on this issue. It was the largest youth-driven child's rights movement in history, in Canadian history, and she was a Cree woman. She was also nominated for an International Children's Peace Prize award. You know, I think about her story, and it's a story of triumph, but it's kind of a shame, don't you think? She should be a kid. I'm just saying.
So, education for all. Although UNESCO started with 6 goals, we're kind of thinking globally but acting locally. And you've heard that from the stories of our panelists and the positions that they're taking in response to that question. Do any of you have a comment or a question at this point about how you take up the idea of education for all? Right, seeing none, we'll move on to the second question. Oh, Steve, did you have a question, or was that a glasses removal?
Well, I take my glasses off, Wendy, so I can see better.
I'm the big purple thing up here coordinating with the decor.
That's all good. Education for all. Just maybe comment, Katina, Bill, and Candace, from a staff perspective, whether they're faculty or student or teachers in the system. Education for all includes people who are lifelong learners. And how does that fit? Is there a perspective that kind of matches and mirrors what you're talking about? So, I'm throwing you off, but if I am, move on.
Go ahead. You're welcome.
Just to ask for clarity, so you're thinking about lifelong learning and education for all, so you're thinking about for people in the system, not just the yeah, that's a difficult one because it depends on what we want. There's a hidden message in there for some, I would say, in the public education system that it would depend on what people want to learn and what they want access to. So if we're talking about professional learning that would help support measurable outcomes, there might be lots of opportunities. But when we're talking about supports for people who might want to go against the status quo and shake things up a bit, then that becomes a little dicey. Is that what you mean? Is that what you're thinking about?
I'm thinking that in part. I'm also sort of thinking of learning from all. In other words, that reciprocal action.
So, if I could continue, I want to kind of piggyback what Candace was saying, because late in my career I had an aha moment, and it was unfortunately too late in my career. And I had the pleasure of working with Candace, who taught me an awful lot. So 2 things I would say. One is that regardless if you're an educator or administrator, you need to know what you don't know. Because if you don't know, if you think you know what you don't know, you can do damage. And my aha moment was, and I taught for many, many years, I taught Aboriginal children, and I thought I knew it. And it wasn't until I learned of the history of the Canadian education system and the history of Ontario that I went, it's not me. I represent the education system. And if I had known about the history of residential schools as an early teacher, I would have done things way differently as a teacher, as an administrator, as a director. But it was too late in my career. So what I'm saying, Steve, is that we have to do a better job preparing new teachers in terms of the history of the education system in which they're going to work. We have to do a better job with educators in terms of reminding them, because you can get caught up in the minutiae and the details and the struggles of a day, and it's easy to forget the lessons learned earlier. So the learning cycle really is a cycle, and not that it is from this moment on, but I need to go back and remind myself of things I've learned earlier. But we have to do a critically better job in terms of providing new teachers with the history of education in this country, in this province. And again, there we have an opportunity through research, through post-secondary, through the Faculty of Education, and preparing teachers and professional development of current teachers. I'm not sure if that's what you're talking about, but I'm going to take it as that. Yeah.
Anyone else have a comment?
Sorry, Karen, I'm taking over your moderating.
So when we're discussing education for all students and schooling for all, we're inevitably talking about resources, and there are some administrators and educational leadership people on this panel, and especially in terms of Aboriginal education as well. And in Ontario, we do spend over $20 billion on education. It is a big pie, and yet how do we ensure that all students are getting access to the capital, to the resources that they can succeed within that pie? How do we, in terms of allocating resources, and in terms of ensuring that each student is getting what they need? So that's an admin perspective. Piggybacking that point is we should consider the allocation of resources in terms of the growing inequality of wealth. And we know from the research that socioeconomic status and inequality of wealth leads to inequality of outcomes inside of schools. My second question, which is
Not that was your second question.
I sensed a cold in there. There's a cold.
But you must have some you must have some thoughts on this, so why don't you speak to that?
Yeah.
Come on, Michael. No,
Yes,
come on.
Michael, we're inviting you. Please.
My third point is in a place like Ontario,
Yeah.
where we do have resources, and increasingly, whether you want to talk about globalization, the knowledge economy, whatever, increasingly there appears to be a need for post-secondary education, whether at the university or college level. Is it time to discuss education for all in terms of post-secondary education and universal access to colleges, universities, and other institutions?
Well, that one's yes. Next.
Okay, did anyone want to tackle
Well, I do.
the administrative?
Oh, don't get me
Financing
started.
part?
Okay, don't get me started. Okay. Yeah.
I'm watching the clock on you here, Mr. Tucker.
Oh, what the heck. Under the Liberal government in the past 10 years, the Ministry of Education has become more controlling than it was under the Conservative government with Premier Harris. It is far more controlling in terms of the packages or envelopes in which funding is allocated to school boards. Example, I'm sitting at a table in the director's conference room, and I find out that the former premier announced that we had to hire approximately 10 full-time positions as support staff as part of the contract negotiated with CUPE. Would we have hired those individuals? No. And we knew that after 2 years that funding was going to be cut to the board. But the residual effect was we now had 12 contract positions that we had to find funding for to maintain those positions. Or we had to reduce it through retirements or resignations. That would have been money that we could have allocated directly to the classroom. It could have been money we could have hired staff where there was a need. And so my answer is that boards have lost the ability to allocate as much funds as they wish to in certain areas. The other issue that is really applying financial pressure to school board is the area of mental health. And when I was superintendent of special ed, the budget for special education was $80 million, 1,600 staff members allocated. At the beginning of my tenure in that department, mental health had a very small percentage in terms of dollars support. By the time I moved out of special ed 3.5 years later, we were spending almost $10 million to support students in mental health, over 10% of the budget. So we as a society in Ontario, we have to do things differently with mental health. Because what we found is that doctors were saying, there are no beds available for your son, but if you register him at this school, they've got a great support mechanism. We were being used as a treatment facility for psychiatrists. That's wrong. So those are two examples of the financial constraint with which school boards are finding themselves in.
Michael, did you have a comment back?
No, that's a good example. Please, I know I asked too many questions and we're
No such thing. No such thing. Katina, did you want to respond?
Well, I was just thinking, I wanted to let's think about this in a let's back it up a little bit, because you're talking about resource allocations, but for what? So we're also thinking about what's the end goal here, because there are multiple accountability systems that are at play in public school systems, and right now performance-based accountability is the in fad, and it's the most dominant one, and if we're talking about allocating resources so that students will do better on measurable outcomes, that's one kind of allocation of resources. But if we're talking about allocating resources for students who will be successful in society, and that might not be just being able to read and write. It might be other kinds of things that we might want them to do. That's a whole another story. So it's not just about allocating of resources, it's about the goals and values that are used to make those decisions. And I think we need to think about that sometimes, because I think sometimes the bigger picture is lost. Because as Einstein would say, not all meaningful things can be measured, not all measurable things are meaningful. So
Yes, please.
For Candace, actually. Have you been able to witness how storytelling has been a part of education for educators?
Oh yeah, absolutely. I think a lot of teachers recognize the power of storytelling in terms of disseminating and sharing and teaching about Indigenous peoples, and Indigenous scholars are using storytelling in very exciting ways in terms of their scholarship. So yeah, there's definitely room to explore that, and I think people are seeing the transformative potential, because ultimately, in order for us to, I guess, activate in what Steve Killip was talking about earlier around, we need to educate people about this, and Bill was talking about that too. We need to build people's capacity and understanding and cultural competency, and I think storytelling can be an effective way of doing that, because it reaches to the empathetic sense, right? And we can have we can recognize maybe why things are the way they are, and understand a little bit more the contemporary realities and where maybe Indigenous peoples are coming from. I mean, we're probably seeing the representation of people in the media, and there's certainly a lot of misrepresentation out there, and sometimes we get kind of we have like this reputation for being difficult or maybe a challenging area. In my experience working in education, sometimes that can happen because we have such a marginalized voice that we're just trying to advocate for ourselves. So storytelling kind of reaches to that. And I've seen some really powerful shifts in people because they see the humanity. Sometimes we kind of forget that there's actually a human being there, right? Yeah, I could go on and on.
Thank you. Thanks, Candace. Martin.
I want to come back to your original question. I think it was there a response to just education for all?
Correct.
And so when I was talking to Katina about it earlier this morning, we took the train together, she mentioned I'm speaking about education for all. The hair on the back of my neck bristled. And why would it do that? So my background is I worked at the international level, and I have dealings with a lot of the organizations like UNESCO, the OAS, and these kind of multi-mega projects. I'm underwhelmed by the lack of strategy, the lack of clear goals, and the inadequate funding and everything else. So for me, when I hear these multi-mega projects that, and they didn't meet any of the 6 goals, not even by a long shot, and they're underfunded by 24 billion or something like that, or 38 billion if you count lower secondary. So that's my initial reaction at the international level. Politics, bureaucracy, some institution out in Paris guiding education systems in 120 somewhat different countries pretending to listen to the other to UNESCO and the like. So I'm frustrated by that because there's a ton of resources being spent on an apparatus, which I actually think has a legitimate purpose, but questions. Coming back to the Ontario context, education for all I don't think means the same thing. I don't think the 6 goals apply here in the same way. But if we go with Bill and the idea of education for each, I think that the neck on my hair persists. Like, there's a problem for me, and I think at both levels the problems are the same. I don't think there's a real serious commitment to education for all. I don't think, and why do I think that? Because politics continues to get in the way. Whenever we have, the points that you raised are absolutely critical, they need to be sorted out. But then there's also no interest in trying to reach a compromise, trying to reach a consensus. It doesn't happen at the political level, it also doesn't happen at our level. It's very difficult for people to come to a table interested to find gray areas to solve the problems. Everyone is instead interested in staking their point. And of course, the final point that I want to make comes down to resources, and that's on your point. We can set all sorts of rules that we want, but there's never a discussion about how to pay for them. And I know that that seems like such a disgusting point when we talk about the purity of education, but the truth of it is these things have to be paid for. And not just the financial things, the other kinds of resources like teacher talent and all these things that the education for all is saying that we need. Those are the same things that are saying here. There are no clear solutions. But I also don't think that there's a serious commitment on the part of a lot of people to really address them. I've worked at every level, classroom, school board, ministry, OECD, and CMAC. No one's asking some of the tough questions. How do you make up for all the awful things that we've done in education to average, not just that, people, to all sorts of different marginalized groups? The questions don't come up. There's every effort to try to put them aside.
Maybe it's because they don't want to know the answers.
Well, that's precisely it. No one wants to talk about numbers either. I'm trying to raise the numbers issue as well. How do we pay for things that I would consider neoliberal, not serious about education? And that just to me, so for me, when I hear education for all, it just makes me want to kind of curl back up into my shell and think, oh goodness, another conversation like this.
Okay, so can we ask you a question then? So what do you think we should do? Like, what do you think would be some of the strategies, some of the advocacy strategies, maybe?
At a personal level, I've decided to make education finance a particular interest of mine because unfortunately people seem to follow the money trail. So if you can manage how resources are allocated, then that is a good step in trying to get things to move in your direction. But that's a really weak way of approaching the problem because ultimately you need to reach a consensus about what you value. And
Yes.
I don't think there's an interest in having that conversation either. I can't tell you how many, there are 7 teachers in my family, and when we get down to we've all worked in the Ontario public education system, and we can't come to an agreement about what we mean by education. And a lot of the other members of my family just see teachers as glorified babysitters. They can't understand how they make their salary, and they think they should be pulled back. How could you ever have a conversation about providing education for all and providing quality education for all when people who are married to these partners think that their job is to be a glorified babysitter? And this is here in Ontario. I just see a lack of real commitment to education and to education for all and to providing education for all. Not, and I'm speaking anecdotally, but I'm also speaking for me.
I'm going to comment too after you.
And just as not to say one quick point, having worked at all of these levels, level, people are trying to harm children. That's not at all the case. They
Relieved.
all
We just
are
want to clarify
interested
that.
in education, but they're not interested in asking the tough questions. They're not interested in pushing the envelope to see real change. And that's why we see a lot of the reports coming out with not meeting the goal, not meeting this. There's no serious effort beyond good intentions.
Thank you. Yeah, Candace,
Yeah, I'm going to speak from an F&MI point of view, and I want to just clarify that I've worked at an institutional level in education systems, but I haven't worked at a provincial level or an international level, so I'm coming from that point of view. But from what I can tell, I mean, of course, policy has a huge impact, and the F&MI policy framework has, opened the doors for a lot of change. A lot of change has happened. I mean, we're still dealing with issues at the federal level with First Nations schools on reserves, and it's not addressing that, and there's still a lot to do. But it does help, to compel institutions, boards to, make some changes, start looking at the policy, start doing strategic planning, that sort of. So strong policy design does help, and of course the funding attached to it. They should be mandated, and in Ontario they're not mandated, so I feel like that's definitely does a disservice to the area. A little shaming never goes up. It always helps, when you compare yourself to other provinces. Of course, Ontario is lagging behind when it comes to Aboriginal education. But I'm going to be so bold as to say it really takes all of us to be willing to, shift the current resources and make structural shifts with what we have and reprioritize. Shall I dare say that? I mean, we have to correct what has happened. We all benefit, including myself, indirectly from the history of this country, and we have social responsibility. We are a social institution. We have a social responsibility, in my mind, a moral imperative to correct this. So, it's about reprioritizing and not just expecting extra all the time. And I see a lot of institutions, they won't do it unless you got the extra funding. Well, let's does this really matter? Let's really be honest about that. I'm being pretty bold saying that, but there's it's the neoliberal agenda. We've got to question that. We've got to challenge that. It's not always it's not always about money. It's about doing the right thing. That's my point of view. That's where I'm at in my career. But
I was going to say it's not always about the money. It isn't. There's so many things you can do. But one of the things that I believed in, because politics is huge in education, and the director's office, it's huge. In fact, that's your job. You're a politician. And part of my job was to buffer or siphon out as much politics as possible for the superintendents. And I viewed their job as to siphon out or buffer a lot of my politics for principals and so on down the line. Because at the very heart of the matter, the school is a reflection of the community in which it's located. And the school board is a reflection of the geographic area. And as much as policy is important and the mandates, I'm baffled sometimes why we have to legislate common sense. It just blows me away. But we do. And unfortunately, those policies earn money. But I hate flavor of the day. I hate flavor of the month. It's what's best for those kids. I learned more by talking to the Somalian elders where I was principal about the kids that were in the school and what they had to live through to get to Canada. Because I had no idea. I was floored and explained. I had all the curtain pulled apart. And as a staff, we talked about it and we knew what we could do and knew what had to do. We didn't need extra funding, but we needed a differentiated approach, and we needed to work together, and we needed to work with the elders to provide the proper supports and compassionate supports necessary for those kids. So there's lots of things you can do, but I still believe that those in leadership positions need to, as much as they can, buffer out the politics. I got phone calls all the time from Toronto, and I'd have to hold the phone out like this. But it was worth it, because as long as that's where it stopped, I was good with that.
I think that's a perfect perfect segue into a question about what is the role of leadership. And just Candace and I were speaking before the panel started, and she and I both believe in the power of narrative. And I'm also an edge walker, not with First Nations communities, but my own research stemmed from my work as a school principal with a number of students, 85% actually of my school, were from the Old Colony Mennonite population. And again, you would walk into the school, but you wouldn't see visual minorities because these are children that are either Spanish looking or very blonde hair, blue eyed, but their first language is Low German, which is neither written nor read. And they would come to school not having the understanding of English in order to write EQAO assessments, etc. And yet, when we looked at how we could best support these students, they were also culturally, spiritually, and educationally in a very different place than we were with an Ontario school system. So I took it upon myself to ask the research questions about what could we as principals learn from these children, what could their stories tell us. And it wasn't until I traveled, being fortunate enough to win a SSHRC grant, traveled to Mexico where these children lived for the other half of their year when they weren't with me in my school. And I actually saw the schools that they attended in Mexico on small campos outside Cuauhtémoc and some of the other inland settlements that they had. And it was like going back to the 1940s and 50s, where their classrooms were segregated by gender, where there was one teacher who was male, where there was a blackboard at the front of the class, and the rest of their work was done by rote. So when I could see that and encapsulate that and then understand, aha, as Bill said, this is why what we're trying to do when we're back at this school in rural southwestern Ontario, this is why this doesn't work now. They're not used to being separated from their siblings, and they too have large families of up to 12 and 14 children in some cases. So when I was able to put those kinds of pieces together and do a little bit of research, learning, as Dr. Killip said, with and from, and not over top of, did I start to be able to make change. Not because we got extra funding for Old Colony Mennonite children. Goodness, they weren't even recognized in the ministry multicultural handbook that came out to all of the schools in Ontario. Indeed, we had to write the pages for insertion into that book. So certainly they were minoritized, and by that I mean by virtue of their population, they should have had a dominant voice, but didn't. But they were also marginalized. And so those lessons motivated my research. And I guess I wonder, what role does research play in translating education for all into practice? Someone want to tackle that one? Candace, can we start with you this time?
Okay.
As she's flipping through her notes, she's done her homework.
Page 5.
Well, I'm a real pragmatic person. What's the point of doing research if it's not going to have real world impact? So, I mean, that's kind of my position on it. I guess to talk from right now I'm the manager of Indigenous Services here at Western, and so we recognize in our unit more that evaluation is really important, and it's going to help us be more responsive to the students that we serve. We're growing at an average, in terms of Indigenous student population, we're growing at an average 12% annual growth rate. So we're seeing a huge shift in the students. We're growing out of our space, although the space was just allocated to us in 2009. We're already busting out of the space, which is fantastic. You know, we have a growing Indigenous graduate student population. A lot of our students are mature students, so they have different needs. Many have families, and a lot commute in. They don't stay in residence. You know, there's just a different experience for Indigenous students, and so we want to be able to respond to that, and we also need to better understand that through evidence-based data and program evaluation. So, you know, I'm working with a faculty member here in the Faculty of Education, Dr. Claire Crooks, and we're developing a student survey to better understand the students, but we're also challenging, we're working from some surveys that were developed at Simon Fraser University and University of Winnipeg, and we're developing some culturally relevant indicators as well. So we want to look at school connectedness, cultural identity, community connectedness, because we're also taking a strength-based approach to this, and we're working alongside students and staff and administrators to help shape the survey and develop the tool so that it's, we're building capacity at the same time. So it's really exciting to take, something like that, and we know that, well, the hope is that we can be responsive with the information that we get. So there is a good example of how we can, translate it into practice. And from an Indigenous point of view, like our communities, the stakes are high. Like we're in a state of crisis, like literally. So, we don't need research that's not going to be relevant, that's not going to be disseminated, responsive to the needs. Like, it's a waste of our time, and we've been over-researched as a people as well, right? And it's a bit of a dirty word, as Linda Smith says, So we can't afford to waste resources and time and energy on something that's not going to be effective. So it's working with community on that. I love collaborative action research is really effective in working with community right from the get-go, and community-based research is also really effective. So there's some really good methodologies out there that we can build on. And so it's an exciting time, and I think there's a lot of hope there, but it's about social change. Like I look at research as it's about social change. Like there's a bigger purpose for me there, but I'm not a theory. Like I like theory, but I'm not just. I don't just stay there. I do. I want to do something.
Thanks, Candace. Katina?
So I'm going to put on my knowledge mobilization hat and just speak a little bit here.
And see, it's perfect because Candace just said she's a do person. So then we'll bring it to you to help do.
Okay. So, the whole notion of evidence-based research informing practice and policy is not something new. The thought around that might be newer in education, but and coming to the forefront. But other sectors such as health are way further ahead of us, but I wouldn't say by much. So I'll just give you a statistic from the health field. So research that's happened 10 years ago probably has only been taken up in practice by 17%. So when we think about practices and research in health, you would think that anything that was new, groundbreaking, would probably be institutionalized or taken up in practice fairly soon, particularly when we're talking about life-threatening diseases and issues and all those kinds of things. It's even less in education. So one can say, well, why do we bother to do research? Is it just for for fun because people like to do those kinds of things, or is there a social and moral purpose? And that in the last 10 to 15 years, I know there are policymakers at large jurisdictions and provincially, nationally, and internationally who are trying to think about how do we connect this research use, and I wouldn't say a one-way linear relationship, maybe a research use loop. How do we close it, and how do we make it narrower and more fulfilling? Because it's not just about researchers doing research on people, like teachers, particular marginalized groups, and then walking away. It's talking about doing research with people and staying with that community and working through the research project process, designing, delivering, and then not walking away at the end, but also working with the consequences of the findings and what the next steps may be. This is not a project. When we look at how decisions are made politically, we see that the role of research is very small. Often it has to do with political will, has to do with optics, has to do with resources. Sometimes it has to do with a decision has to be made by tomorrow, and it's what we know right now. Sometimes it's done haphazardly. And there's lots of research out there to talk about that, actually. Does that make any difference around that part? Well, that's for another panel around policy and implementation that we'll do next year, maybe. So I would say that we have a lot of work in building capacity where we consider the research that has happened and the research that continues to happen and the research that will happen in the decades to come. In the field of education leadership or leadership in general, I mean, listen, go to chapters. They probably got a whole shelf, a whole section around leadership. And if we were to do some kind of analysis around it, they'd probably be saying the same. A lot of, like, you know, key messages that we've already beat to death. In some situations, it's about synthesizing the information in meaningful ways so it can be taken up. And that's where sometimes we really fall down. We think that by producing research, it's just going to automatically be taken up, and that's not the case. In academia, we call it dissemination, and it's in academic journals. Yeah, well, that's just for other academics. But for the real meaningful change in social processes and practices, it has to be produced and generated in a different kind of way, in a more meaningful kind of way. And I mean, that's a challenge for all of you here, is to think about how you're going to do that in education for all.
Thank you.
Well, just a summary comment. I feel that the research is equally important in the classroom, and what a great opportunity for you as a classroom teacher or administrator to do research in the classroom in terms of your own best practices or school's best practices. And I really think that the change in our society will necessitate a change in approach of utilizing research and practice. I mean, this little machine here has revolutionized, or should revolutionize, classroom practice. And teachers are no longer the primary provider of information. It's learning how to access that information.
And critique it.
And critique it. And challenge it. And in my world, universities were the institutions that challenged beliefs and thoughts and theories. And they were the leaders of change. And so we have to utilize that opportunity for research and model how research can translate into best practices so that schools and school boards and teachers themselves learn how to do research.
Thank you. Tina, you had a response?
I want, at the end, have use research. I think if there was some way that we could think about research as not being that abstract thing where we do things on people and then for some reason there's research and then there's practice. Where does the research come from? I mean, we're a professional faculty, so the research comes from interacting with professionals, at least I'm hoping, in most cases, except for, you know, pure theoretical, philosophical ventures and conceptualizations, which I would say I know a number of philosophers who do research in schools and empirical research in schools. And I think this notion that, well, you're a researcher and then we're going to take what you have and it's somehow separate from what teachers and principals and educators do is an injustice. I mean, where do you think I got my stuff from, you know, kind of thing. It's because I actually worked and talked with people who are practitioners, and I'm just reporting back what I have heard. It's not some far off thing that came from outer space. So, and in thinking about teachers as practitioners, I mean, there are models where it's seamless, where there's this notion that people want to improve their practice, and while they might talk to their neighbor next door in the next classroom about what improvements might be, they do consider research, and they understand research to be different kinds of things. It can be action research in their classroom. It doesn't have to necessarily be what we call research from the Ivy Tower. But it requires particular kinds of skills and knowledge that I think sometimes we need to learn and share as a profession. Yes.
Oh, why did I know there would be a response? Did you rehearse this on the train this morning?
No.
All right.
But I'm traveling on the train on the way
okay,
back,
all right.
so don't you
So
worry.
I was going to say, don't make me have to come with you. Brenton.
So each of you are leaders in your own right, and I think you all have interactions with other kinds of leaders as well. So my question is, one, what are the main obstacles in implementing research from a leadership perspective? Two, are necessarily imposing a view. Much like coming back to the revised sex ed education, you can go to the research all you want. You are imposing a view on the public and on parents and families. How does the leader reconcile that, especially if they don't necessarily subscribe to education for all? So, obstacles, weight given to research, given its conflicted nature in the social sciences. And then the third point being how do you reconcile the fact that you necessarily impose a view on others when you...
I'm going to start with the third one because that's what I did best. No, I'm just
And having worked for him, both when he was a principal and as a director, I can talk in the hallway afterwards about what it was really like.
The bottom line for me is did I believe it was best for students? And if the answer is yes, go for it.
Yep.
I'll suffer any slings and arrows. If I heard the information, I read the information, and I believed, and I had the evidence it was best for students, we're doing it. And I would get the phone call from Toronto, I'd get a phone call from a trustee, but I was hired to improve opportunities and improve student learning. I could go to sleep at night just fine. If I did something because it was politically correct as opposed to best for students, I struggled with that. I had a lot of problems going to sleep at night.
But if you have a student who comes into the class and it's being sex ed curriculum, and they're being taught about same-sex families, and the parents have said, I do not want my child to be exposed to the new sex ed curriculum, they get removed from the classroom. They are necessarily excluded from education. But you have been imposed on what's going to be taught in the classroom. So even though the evidence is there, I would imagine that you hopefully support the new sex ed curriculum, you can go to bed knowing that you have done the right thing, but you're also excluding a child from education.
Sometimes I didn't exclude them. As a principal, I didn't exclude everybody. I mean, I had the right as a principal to say yay or nay. And so, you know what? Every situation is different, but I had regular requests from one community that didn't want students involved in music. And I met with the community, I met with the parents, and I said, I'm sorry, those students are taking music because A, B, and C. If I thought it was best for the student not to be excluded from a program, yeah, I would grant that exclusion. But we would have to provide similar curricular expectations right elsewhere. So it comes down to me, and you're right, it's not a black and white answer. Leadership's not black and white. There's a lot of gray. There's a lot of gray. Policies are not black and white. There's a lot of gray. And you learn how to navigate that gray. But I'll say it again, Brendan. If I believed it was best for kids, I slept just fine.
I don't want to go on too long, but when it comes to FNMI education, I mean, it's different at the K-12 and the post-secondary level, but one of the things is the difference between how one defines success when you look at it from the educational system point of view and then Aboriginal partner point of view. There's often collision happening there. So, and then there's also, for instance, standardized tests. And looking at the gaps between Aboriginal and non-Aboriginal. I mean, the policy says that that's what you focus on. That's what education systems are measuring on. But from community's point of view, they want to see stories and the qualitative approach, not just the standardized test. So there's a disconnect sometimes, and it's just finding that balance between both when you're talking about research. And then when you're talking to Indigenous communities, it's great to pull out some research when you're talking to, and I was always just middle manager. I didn't make the final decisions. I could just help sway. But, you'll pull out research findings when you're talking to senior administrators. But when you're talking to a community member or to your community partners, which at the K-12 and post-secondary level, we have Aboriginal education councils. They're mandated by the province. So, you're not going to lead in the same way. So you have to be able to be aware of those different approaches to, I guess, sharing why this is compelling. And self-identification is a really challenging area that I've been involved in both areas of education. And it's from an Indigenous community point of view, there's this sense of feeling under surveillance, and the government, the ministries' interference. And we recently had the bill C3 come out, and there's some authority that the ministry now has in gathering personal information, which is infringing on personal information, rights to personal information. So there's a lot of tension there, which has to do, again, with history, right? So it's understanding all of that and being able to know your audience and know when to use certain research and how, if that makes any sense. So it's pretty complicated.
Katina. Okay, so the first question I believe was about the obstacles. So I think for me it has been learning that sometimes a good dose of good political acumen gets a person a lot of mileage, and sometimes that can blow up in a person's face. It's also knowing that sometimes not all battles can be won, and choosing which battles are are worth fighting. Dying on the stake. And I also would say it's the and this leads into weighting, the conflicted findings. In social sciences, there are lots of different perspectives and stuff. It's being able to realize that we live with, personally as well as professionally and research-wise, we often live with conflicts, right? So we have to be aware of what those conflicting values are, what those conflicting understandings are, and understand why they might be conflicting. Because in some senses, it's really about what we want to also believe in, also what we want to ignore, and understanding that that might be what is happening. And I'm sorry I'm talking in abstracts here, but if you're in the middle of research or finishing research, you'll know what I mean. If not, hold on, it will come. And I think, we'll go to the class that we teach, Brenton. I mean, Brenton and I teach a class around the aims of education, and every week it's a different aim of education. And, we talk about seeing parts of it we see and of a particular week. So it might be conservative, neoliberal, liberal, Catholic, religious, what are some of the other ones? Critical, democratic, and there are overlaps. And we may see ourselves in all of those, but we gravitate maybe to one more than another. In that sense, I would say my professional thing is to try to expose students to the many different aims of education. But I also know the ones that kind of make me squirm in my seat a little more, because I don't necessarily agree with that one quite as much. And also knowing that I have to be professional in the sense that it's not my views that I'm supposed to be espousing on the students in our course, because it's a fairly general course covering all. But I do know where I sit. And I realize, too, that I need to be able to negotiate with people who don't see the world the same way as me. So that comes with being strategic about how research may be used. Because, quite frankly, lots of change does not happen based on research. People can be shown the facts. They can be shown bodies of evidence, not just one little study. We're talking bodies of evidence. And they still choose not to believe. And in those situations, I don't think it's going to matter how much more evidence we generate for people to change their beliefs. That's just the way it's going to be. But it's how to work with moving forward and working with people who have different views is probably the more important thing. But I also think that, when I think about, I'll give you an example. It's very, very pragmatic. If you think doing research is apolitical, you are mistaken, because research is not apolitical. And that's probably one of the things that we don't necessarily talk about in higher education when we're talking about research-intensive programs and students doing research, because it's not apolitical. So I recently did, I did 2 studies recently for what could be considered 2 different oppositional groups, depending on which year it is for negotiations. So, and in releasing the research, there were times when I thought, ooh, this group is never going to ever hire me to do any more research for them, because they think I'm playing for the other team. And in the other group, I'm thinking, as soon as we release that research, oh, they think I'm playing for the other team. I've had situations where I've had the politicking that has gone on behind doing research. It's not like, oh, I have an idea, I'll put in some money, I'll get a grant, oh gee, that's great. Now, you know what, I'm going to do an ethical review, and then I'm going to find the people I need to do my work with, and then we do it, and then I just release my research. In situations that I've been involved in the last 18 months, it has been, okay, so I'm going to tell you what the findings are, I'm going to share with the Executive Council. We're going to talk about what those findings are. We're going to come spend an afternoon because this is what the findings are. Then you need to decide how you're going to share that with your membership. Then I'm going to give you 6 to 8 months to share that with your membership before I release it to the public. Then when I release it to the public, these are the things I'm going to highlight, even though I'm going to release all of it. But I'm going to tell you these are the things that I'm going to go on. And you need to figure out how you are going to respond to that, and I'm going to because I need to give you forewarning. Now, I'm doing that because I am playing a political game here. I could easily have done the research, release the study, and probably all hell would have broken loose because people would not have been forewarned about particular kinds of things that were going to be shared. I've been in situations where I've had associations and jurisdictions say, can you not release that? And my response is no. I'm not going to not do that. That goes against my principles. What I will do is I'll share, again, I will give you a period of time, I will let you read the final report, I will let you give me what comments you think are going to be the ones that are going to be the touchy ones, and all of those kinds of things. I've had research that has sat around on my desk for months and months and months, ready to be released, but not because it was not the right political time. And I have to think about what the implications are for the release of the data. Who may I be making vulnerable based on this? As a researcher, some of that information is really important, but for others it might make them vulnerable. And I'll give you a perfect example. In a provincial study that I just did for a principal association, we found that 29% of respondents indicated that they self-medicate. 29%. Now, as a researcher, like, holy Hannah, that's important to know. It's important to know for a number of reasons, not because of that percentage, but the question is, what's going on for this to be the situation? Now, that wasn't the only coping strategy. There were lots of them, 70-something percent of them were doing other kinds of what I would say, would be healthy ways of coping, but there was a percentage that weren't. So we need to know, if we're going to be supporting this group of professionals, we need to know what is going on. So that percentage for me as a researcher is very critical for lobbying for more money to investigate this further. Now, for the body of people that I am researching and representing, it's not such, they don't view it that way necessarily, all of them. And I didn't necessarily get all the great emails, oh, that's a great job. I got emails like, why did you go tell the world that for? Do you know what that makes us look like? And what will we gain from people knowing that? Which is, it's all true. Now, if you were to read my releases and my tweets, I never tweeted about any of that, although it is in the report. Now, other people got a hold of it and tweeted about that. But I chose, of the tweets that I did, I tried to choose the ones that were less politically charged. And so, I mean, I guess you need to have some kind of research political acumen as well. And you'll figure that out with your group and moving forward. And sometimes things that you might think are the most innocent kinds of things end up being explosive. I was called to a head office asking about another study that was being done at the same time, and people demanding to see the instrument that we were using to make sure that I was not using research findings from a study that I had done with them. Like, it can be a little nuts and it can be a little crazy, and you're not going to find that in your research methodology book, unfortunately.
Well, just for 60 seconds, I mean, there's another factor that challenges implementation of new curriculum, going back to Brenton was asking, that's ignorance. Non-knowledge of what the curricular change is. And reading about it in the paper, or hearing about it in the media somewhere, and explaining to the stakeholder what actually is in the curriculum and the benefits to students. And the best way to do that, research offers clarity. Unbiased clarity.
Well,
And with that, it was cool.
Yeah, well, I'm looking at the time and recognizing that we're to be wrapping up in a few minutes, and I'm to offer a summary comment. And in listening to our learned colleagues here and also in the illuminating questions we've had from the floor, two things have resonated for me throughout this last hour. And I think it's the idea that in education for all, leadership at many levels is very important. But although we can be leaders in the classroom, in the school, here in the Faculty of Education, we can't discount the importance of that individual voice. And that leads me into the second point that says it behooves us, whether we are practitioner researchers, researcher practitioners, or people who aren't sure where we fall along that continuum yet, it behooves us to learn with and from those with whom we are working in order that we can move forward an agenda on education for all. I'd like to invite you please to join with me in thanking our panelists this evening.
Thank you, Wendy.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Wendy.
And thank you for joining us. On behalf of the Planning Committee, I would like to invite you to return to the community room where I know that in the next few minutes they're going to be serving some refreshments while you observe some of the research posters that are on display there. So please go and enjoy yourselves and learn with and from each other.